The ship groaned under the immense pressure of re-entry, metal shrieking as if in protest. Aaron Tate gripped the control panel, knuckles white, sweat streaming down his temples as he fought to stabilize the vessel. Outside the cockpit's reinforced glass, the stars blurred into fiery streaks, swallowed by the dense, impenetrable shroud of the planet's atmosphere. The display screens flickered with warnings, amber lights turning to blood red as systems failed one by one. Mayday, Mayday. This is Captain Aaron Tate of the Peregrine, requesting immediate assistance, he shouted into the comm. The static response was deafening, the silence on the other end almost mocking. The realization clawed at him. No one was out there, no one could hear him. With a shudder that reverberated through the entirety of the Peregrine, the ship broke through the lower clouds and plummeted toward the surface. Below him stretched an alien landscape lit in hues of deep purples and blacks, its contours shifting with unnatural fluidity. The terrain looked almost alive, moving in strange patterns that made his vision swim. "Come on, hold together," Aaron muttered through clenched teeth, wrenching the control stick to the left to avoid a jagged cliff of crystalline rock that jutted out from the mist. Sparks erupted from the dashboard, and the smell of singed wiring choked the air. The ship screamed one last time before the inevitable impact. Metal met Earth with a deafening boom, and everything went black. When Aaron came to, there was silence. Not the familiar quiet of deep space, but an unsettling, suffocating void. He blinked, vision blurry, the rhythmic pulse of pain behind his eyes pounding like a drum. Blood, dark and thick, trickled down his forehead, stinging as it seeped into the corner of his eye. The cockpit was a twisted wreckage around him, shards of glass and metal glistening under the dim light. Forcing himself upright, he surveyed the scene. The walls of the ship had crumpled inward, creating jagged shadows that danced as the emergency lights flickered weakly. He unbuckled his harness, the effort causing a sharp pain to shoot through his ribs. Broken, or at least cracked, he thought grimly. Grabbing the remnants of a support rail, he hauled himself to his feet, ignoring the throbbing ache that threatened to topple him. Outside, an eerie, perpetual twilight enveloped everything. The sky was neither day nor night, but a deep, bruised color, swirling with streaks of oily green clouds. Aaron peered through the shattered viewport and felt his breath catch in his throat. The ground, far from the expected rocky terrain, seemed to shift under its own volition. It was dark and viscous, like a living organism exhaling slowly. Serrated trees with trunks as black as coal jutted from the surface, their branches curving like talons toward the sky. Each one pulsed faintly, a heartbeat that synchronized with the planet itself. He shuddered, unable to tear his gaze from the hypnotic, undulating forest. The first step outside would be more than exploration. It would be a plunge into something that defied logic, a place where science had no foothold. Aaron reached for his emergency kit, only to find it smashed under a fallen panel. Swearing under his breath, he scrounged through the wreckage, salvaging what he could, a utility knife, a flare, and his emergency transmitter, its light blinking with weak defiance. "All right, Tate," he whispered, the sound of his own voice somehow comforting. "You survived the crash. Now survive this." The silence that answered seemed to mock him, stretching out as the alien forest continued its slow, rhythmic motion, as though waiting for him to make the first move. A gust of warm wind swept through the cracked hull, carrying with it a strange metallic tang. Aaron's nostrils flared as he inhaled, eyes narrowing at the hint of something familiar. Blood, but older. more pungent, like iron left to rust under relentless rain. He pushed himself through the torn hatch, boots sinking into the spongy ground that quivered underfoot. Each step sent a pulse through the earth, and with each pulse the trees seemed to draw closer, limbs extending by imperceptible increments. He paused, muscles tensing as he scanned the horizon. The silence grew denser, pressing down on him until it seemed to hum inside his skull. Aaron glanced at the transmitter, tapping it for any signs of life. The only response was static, punctuated by sharp bursts of white noise that reminded him of whispers in a distant room. A flicker of movement caught his eye, a shadow that flitted between the trees, black on black, too fast to be anything of this world. Aaron's heartbeat quickened, a cold sweat prickling down his spine. He squeezed the hilt of his knife, fingers slick with nervous perspiration. "You're seeing things, just nerves," he muttered. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The shifting shadows, the pulsing earth. This world was alive in a way that was wrong, a way that made every instinct in his body scream to flee. But there was nowhere to go, and as the shadow reappeared, gliding closer and stretching taller, Aaron realized that the crash had only been the beginning. Aaron's body moved mechanically through the surreal forest, his boots sinking into the pliant living ground with each step. Every sound, the scrape of his utility knife against his suit, the sharp intake of his breath, felt amplified under the blanket of silence that wrapped around him like a shroud. The forest pulsed in a rhythmic thrum, a heartbeat that seemed to resonate with the blood pounding in his ears. He was a trespasser here, an uninvited guest walking through the veins of something ancient and unknown. The grotesque trees towered over him, their bark jagged and oily, each branch tapering to a needle-thin point. No leaves adorned them. Instead, they seemed adorned with spines that bristled as if on the edge of some unseen movement. The air was thick, heavy with moisture, and the ever-present metallic tang that seeped into his lungs like poison. His muscles tightened, the unease spreading like a parasite through his veins. His eyes darted to the emergency transmitter strapped to his forearm, its light flickering faintly. Each pulse of static, each pop of interference played on his nerves. He was alone in the most profound sense of the word, light years from the nearest human, on a world where the concept of hope seemed as alien as the landscape. He pushed forward, the urge to find shelter, to find anything that resembled civilization, overriding his terror. The ground shifted beneath him, a subtle shiver that made him pause. He glanced down, heart freezing at the sight of tendrils of dark, wet soil writhing away from the pressure of his steps. As quickly as they had moved, they stilled, blending seamlessly back into the surface. Aaron stumbled forward, eyes wide, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. Then he saw it, a clearing framed by the sinister branches of the forest. But it was not empty. In the center lay an arrangement of bones, impossibly large and in a pattern too precise to be accidental. They spiraled outward in concentric circles, each one leading into the next, like the coils of a vast albino serpent. The bones gleamed with a sickly luminescent sheen, catching what little light seeped through the sky. Aaron approached, the nausea rising in his gut. These bones were not animal, not in any sense he recognized. The joints were articulated in ways that defied reason, with additional sockets and protrusions that suggested a creature designed not by nature, but by something far more malevolent. He knelt, hesitating as he reached out to touch one of the larger bones. It was warm, almost pulsing beneath his fingertips, as though the marrow still remembered life. The wind shifted, a sudden hot gust that carried with it a low, guttural rumble. It seemed to emanate from the ground itself, rising up to envelop him. Aaron jerked upright, eyes scanning the clearing. Movement caught the corner of his vision, a ripple at the far edge where the forest's shadow was deepest. He turned sharply, hand tightening around the knife at his hip. The shadow was back, larger this time, its shape wrong in ways that made his head throb. It slithered, undulating across the ground with a grace that mocked the very concept of legs or arms. It paused, then shifted in a way that suggested it was watching him, assessing him. The rumble grew, resonating through the ground, a voice without sound. The trees themselves seemed to tremble in response, their branches angling like spears. Aaron's mind screamed for him to run, to tear himself from the paralyzing hold of fear that gripped him. But he stood rooted in place, mesmerized as the shadow began to take form, pooling into a shape that rose and fell with the rhythm of his own labored breathing. The world narrowed to that single grotesque figure, its edges too dark, its presence too tangible. He backed away, the spiral of bones crunching under his boots. The shadow stopped, a pause so long that Aaron's breath caught in his throat. Then, with a slithering hiss, it melted back into the trees, as if it had never been there at all. The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by the hammering of his pulse. Aaron exhaled shakily, backing out of the clearing until the spiral of bones lay just beyond his vision. He turned, nearly tripping over his own feet as he forced himself deeper into the forest. His mind raced, replaying the sight of the bones, the shadow, the oppressive, watching trees. He wasn't just stranded, he was being observed. He felt it in the weight of the air, the way the ground responded to his every move. This was no lifeless rock orbiting an indifferent star. This world had eyes, and it was awake. The transmitter crackled suddenly, a burst of static that erupted so loudly it almost made him drop it. His fingers fumbled to adjust the dials, hope sparking momentarily before it was extinguished. The sound was not a distress beacon, not a communication from a rescue team. It was the sound of something else, something broken and ancient, whispering in a language that bypassed his ears and spoke directly to the marrow of his bones. Aaron felt the ground shift beneath him again, this time with a purpose. The whispering grew, a chorus of voices merging into a single, low growl. He knew then that whatever watched him from the edges of that clearing, whatever coiled in the dark and whispered through the static, was no mindless animal. It was a predator, intelligent and ancient, and it was drawing closer. He ran, the twilight forest swallowing him in shadows, and the low rumble followed, growing with each step. Aaron's eyes darted between the twisted shapes of the forest, muscles tight with the urge to flee, and the stubborn, foolish instinct to stay still. The shadows moved with purpose now, rippling between the trees like ink bleeding into water. He felt the weight of unseen eyes, the pull of something deeper than curiosity, as if the forest itself had become aware of his presence and was savoring the chase. His boots squelched against the wet ground, the gelatinous surface recoiling at his touch as though offended by the intrusion. He pushed forward, ignoring the biting ache in his ribs, the raw metallic taste of fear coating his tongue. The sky above, ever blanketed in hues of deep, bruised purples and greens, churned like a living organism, its pulse thrumming in time with the whispers that followed him. A sharp crack rang out behind him, a branch snapping under the weight of something far larger than any creature he dared to imagine. He spun around, heart thundering, knife clutched in his shaking hand. The forest fell into a deathly silence, as if waiting for him to make a move. But there, beyond the dense thicket of serrated trees, something shifted. It moved with a grace that made no sound, an undulating shadow that defied form. His eyes strained to follow it, to make sense of the impossible angles and dark hollows that mocked the very concept of limbs and body. The air grew thick, pressing down on him, the sudden shift in pressure popping his ears painfully. He stumbled backward, breath catching in his throat as the scent of decay washed over him, damp, old, and sharp like rotting metal. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs felt trapped in the mire of his own terror. Then it came, the sound that would haunt his dreams forever. A clicking, wet and rhythmic, like the sound of a broken engine sputtering, fused with the gurgling of water rushing through a shattered pipe. It wasn't coming from behind him. It surrounded him, vibrating through the ground, resonating in his bones. He clutched at his ears, the sound piercing through his fingers as if they were made of paper. "Move," his brain urged, clawing through the static haze of fear. Somehow his body obeyed, jerking into motion as he broke into a blind, staggering run. The ground seemed to rise and fall under him, pulsing with that alien heartbeat, and he struggled to keep his footing. Branches, sharp and serrated, lashed at him, leaving thin, stinging cuts along his arms and face. He didn't stop, couldn't afford to. The clicking sound grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever was making it was closing in, testing him. Aaron's breath came in ragged gasps, each inhalation scraping his dry throat like sandpaper. He risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't. The shadow had split into tendrils, dark limbs that slithered along the forest floor and wrapped around trees with unnatural ease. They moved with the intelligence of a creature that knew its prey had nowhere left to run. A root caught his boot, sending him sprawling forward. Pain lanced through his body as he landed hard, his palms sinking into the spongy ground that seemed to shiver with delight. He rolled onto his back, eyes wide as he tried to scramble away, his pulse a wild drumbeat in his ears. The forest around him shifted, branches bending in closer, the sky above seeming to darken, as if something immense was leaning over him, blotting out the little light that remained. The tendrils retracted, and for a moment, there was silence. Aaron's chest heaved as he sucked in air, staring up at the twisted canopy and feeling that last ember of hope flicker. But then, from the shadow between the trees, it emerged. The figure unfolded, rising with an almost deliberate slowness, as if savoring the moment. Its surface glistened, wet and segmented, with too many limbs, each one jointed and coiling. Its body rippled like liquid, dark and reflective, and its face, or what passed for one, was a smooth obsidian void punctuated by eyes as black and depthless as the space between stars. The clicking returned, deep and resonant now, vibrating not just the air but Aaron's very marrow. He felt an involuntary shudder run through him, a loss of control that numbed his limbs and locked him in place. The creature's eyes focused on him, the clicking halting as if it had reached a conclusion. A deep, humming vibration filled the air, and Aaron felt it deep in his chest. It was not just sound, but a sensation, a pressure that forced him to bow his head. It whispered in his mind, a torrent of images and memories that were not his, skies blotted out by winged horrors, seas churning with forms that defied the limits of biology, the screams of beings long forgotten. He was a vessel, a conduit for the terrible collective memory of an ancient predator. The tendrils advanced, pausing just a breath away from his skin. He could feel their cold, pulsing energy, a hair's breadth from contact. They hovered there, waiting, as if savoring his final moment of lucidity. And in that pause, Aaron realized with a clarity born of despair that he would not be killed outright. No, whatever this creature was, it fed on more than flesh. It consumed the essence, the will. He was already part of its story, a chapter that would end not in death, but in assimilation. The forest seemed to lean in as one, branches pressing close, obscuring the sky. The dark, twisted landscape pulsed once more, and then the tendrils lunged. The last sound Aaron heard was the clicking song, triumphant and deep, echoing in the marrow of his bones as the world faded to black. Aaron Tate's vision swam as the world snapped back into focus. The forest around him seemed to pulse with a sinister sentience, the trees inching closer with limbs that twisted like skeletal fingers. The air was heavy, charged with an electric tang that buzzed at the edge of his senses. Darkness had deepened, suffocating the faint light of the sky until only a thin, sickly glow remained. The whispers in the distance coalesced into a hum, low and resonant, vibrating through the ground, through the hollow ache of his body. He stood on the cusp of the clearing, where the spiral of bones awaited, gleaming with an unnatural cold fire. Aaron's breath came in shallow, ragged bursts, each inhale scraping against the rawness in his throat. He took a step forward, knees trembling, eyes darting between the shifting shadows that now encircled him. The clearing was more than just a place. It was an altar, an ancient stage set for a play that had repeated countless times before, one where he was not the first nor would be the last. The shadows thickened, merging into a single shape that loomed above him, larger than any living thing had a right to be. The creature unfurled from the darkness, a grotesque figure that defied comprehension. Its surface shimmered with a wet, black sheen, limbs moving with the fluidity of oil, impossibly jointed, folding and unfolding with a malevolent grace. Its eyes, twin pools of utter void, found Aaron's and held them with a gaze that stripped him bare, peering not at his body but into the depths of his soul. The sound began, a deep, guttural clicking that resonated inside his skull. It was not just noise, it was a language, an ancient dialect that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the neurons, igniting flashes of memories that weren't his. Aaron flinched as visions flooded his mind, an endless expanse of alien ruins bathed in cold starlight, fields littered with bones arranged in those same intricate spirals, and the screams, endless, echoing cries that splintered into silence. He fell to his knees, the transmitter strapped to his arm sputtering static in response, a pitiful signal lost in the hum of the creature's song. The tendrils reached out, moving with the slow deliberation of a predator that had all the time in the universe. One brushed his arm, icy and smooth, sending a paralyzing chill coursing through him. His fingers twitched, the knife slipping from his grip and sinking into the living earth. The world contracted, narrowing to the point of contact where the creature connected with him. Terror boiled inside him, mingling with a helpless, nauseating surrender. There was no fight left, no last burst of defiance. It had seen into him, stripped away the pretense of hope, and left him hollow. The tendril traced upward, a caress that mocked comfort, pressing lightly against the side of his head. The whispers in his mind grew louder, more insistent, no longer broken and fragmented but whole, a command that echoed in the primal recesses of his brain. Join. Aaron's vision blurred, the world fracturing into pieces as the creature's will seeped into him. He was not being killed, he was being absorbed, his mind split open and stitched into the dark, incomprehensible fabric of the being that towered above him. He felt himself unravel, thoughts leaking out like water through a sieve, replaced by the memories of others. Faces he had never known filled his mind. Explorers, soldiers, scientists, all with the same final wide-eyed terror etched into their features as they succumbed. His pulse slowed, heartbeats stretching out until they matched the rhythmic thrum of the forest. His body went slack, no longer his own but a shell inhabited by countless other echoes. The trees seemed to exhale, bending in to witness the culmination of the ritual. In the silence that followed, Aaron's last coherent thought surfaced like a bubble in a tar pit. It had never been a hunt. It was a harvesting. The tendril pulsed, and Aaron felt a final shudder pass through him. The clearing around him glowed, the spiral of bones emitting a phosphorescent light that cast long, writhing shadows. The creature stood over him, triumphant, a deity of nightmares crowned in silence. It withdrew slowly, its limbs folding back into the dark, leaving him empty, his eyes staring into nothing. The forest returned to its slumber, the trees whispering secrets only they could know. The clearing remained as it always had, a memorial and a promise, with the bones gleaming softly in their eternal pattern, awaiting the next poor soul who dared to trespass. In the distance, deep within the labyrinth of trees, the clicking began anew, a song without end, echoing the countless voices trapped within the dark, eternal consciousness of the thing that ruled this forgotten world.